Hello everyone, and welcome to the Grim Tutors, your one-stop shop for all things Magic the Gathering. I'm Colton, also known as Pez.
And I'm Oblivion. So, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about deck archetypes.
What does that mean?
It's kind of how you play the deck, or what your deck strategy is. It's archetype.
Oh, okay. So it's like the style.
Yeah.
The cut of its jib.
Yeah, the cut of its jib. So a deck archetype is basically the strategy you're trying to perform out of your deck.
So while there's kind of a few set in stone archetypes, what you do with them might differ depending on like what colors you're playing or what your play style is. So now that we understand that an archetype is essentially the strategy, the overall cut of the jib of a deck, what archetypes are out there? What are things that you're going to commonly see?
So what you're going to commonly see is your bread and butter archetypes, which are aggro, combo, and control.
Let's kind of deep dive into those. So aggro, that's meaning like aggressive.
You're being aggressive. You don't care what your opponent's doing. You're just trying to go as fast as possible to get them to zero.
So that could be either like dealing them direct damage or trying to churn out a whole bunch of
little creatures and hitting them over and over. Lots of things with haste. Lots of direct damage, i.e. like lightning bolts and lava spikes and those forms of things.
So very much just I want to murder you, but fast. What colors are you going to commonly see?
I would say the most common colors for aggro is like your mono red, your red white. Mono white has aggro also, but like for me those are primarily your aggressive colors because they're very efficient 1 and 2 drops that usually have haste and you can attack immediately, and they also have really good direct damage spells.
Kind of the opposite of aggro, so to say, is control. Right?
Right. So with control, it is the very sense of the word that you are trying to control the board state to your liking and control what your opponent is doing. And then your usual win con for that sort of thing is a war of attrition. You've kind of made your opponent spend all of their stuff and you've been reactive to what they're doing, and now they're out of gas and you can play your big creature and just start attacking them and kill them over the course of like 4 turns or so.
So it's less about you going as fast as possible to try and kill them and more of removing or countering what they're doing to build up your mana pool to be able to do something like big and splashy that can help you win the game.
Right, like back in the good old days of blue-white control, your win con was hitting people with Snapcaster Mages and Celestial Colonnade. It turns into like a 4/3 flyer or something like that.
We have kind of one end of the spectrum being I want to go as fast as possible, and then the other end of the spectrum being I want to keep you
from doing everything, and then I'm just going to eventually win the game due to you running out of gas.
I think we have another like archetype that I wouldn't say is in the middle, because I don't think that it's a combination of strategies. I would say it's kind of like its own third circle on the Venn diagram kind of thing, and that's combo.
It is combo. Combo kind of referring to like Storm. It is a deck that you're playing different types of cantrips and rituals, and you're kind of gaining and subtracting mana to draw cards and discard cards, and then eventually you're just casting a whole bunch of spells to the point where you can cast something like Grape Shot. You just hit your opponent for whatever your storm count is for that turn.
So in a combo deck, regardless of what your combo is, it's less of you going really fast and less of you trying to keep your opponent at bay, and it's more of a getting your pieces put together.
Right. It's more about finding your moment.
It really takes like a sweet spot to make sure. I mean, you're obviously still going to be doing things. Like, you're still going to probably be playing removal.
Right.
Spell.
You're still playing your 1-drops, your preordains, whatever. You're gonna just scry 2, draw a card. You're playing some little creatures. You got removal, you got counter spells, but you're waiting for your opening to where you can just kind of vomit on the table and catch your opponent with their pants down, and they just kind of have to sit there and watch you combo off, and then they just
they just dab them. Those are kind of like the main 3 archetypes, and then we have some other things that kind of like sprout off from it. They're just really helpful because a lot of the times when you're using resources that we've talked about previously, like MTG Goldfish or EDH Rec or any website or service or person that's talking about decks, they're gonna say something like Azorius Control or like Boros aggro. And so they're saying these words, and I just think that it's important to make sure that we know what those words mean and what the plan is, because especially if you're using those resources to help find a deck that interests you or to find a deck to build, knowing what you like to play and knowing kind of going into it what the strategy is really helpful, because it's going to keep you from being confused. Maybe. You still might be. I don't know.
That's the hope, is that we help you not be so confused, but Magic's hard.
Magic is hard. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard like, oh yeah, it's kind of like Jund tempo. And I'm like, well, those are certainly words, but like, what does that mean? You know? So kind of going into our like offshoots.
I would say that this one is that Venn diagram, right? So you have your aggro and you have your control, but this is the sweet spot in the middle.
Okay.
that you know, where the 2 circles overlap each other, and that's mid-range. To me, mid-range is a form of playing your aggressive 1-drops. You're also playing a lot of removal, and you're backing that up by playing bigger creatures down the line in the 4 to 5 mana range. You're kind of reacting to what your opponent's doing in the same way that control does, but you also still have certain pieces in your deck that you can be more aggressive. Let's say you're going up against a control deck, you might want to try and be a little more like in line with what they're doing. You know, you kind of like are controlling each other, assessing the threats and stuff like that. Or you could take it in a different spin and you go, oh, I want to be more aggressive because my opponent's trying to play slow. You could also go for the same thing, like you get matched up against an aggro deck with your mid-range. You want to take it more of a control approach to that. You're killing their aggressive 1-drops, you're playing your thought seizes and stuff, you're taking their lightning bolts and what have you out of their hands, and then you have that backed up by the fact that you have large creatures that their removal and their creatures cannot get through.
So it's really like using that Hannah Montana of the best.
Yeah, you got the best of both worlds.
It's its own play style in the sense that depending on what kind of deck you're playing against and depending on how the matchup is, you can either use either an aggressive or a control strategy to help you in the long game.
Right. You put those two together and it helps you in that middle state of the game, which is why it's called that mid-range. You know, control, you're going for the long run. Aggro, you're going for the short turn 3 win kind of thing. And mid-range, you're wanting that nice like turn 4, turn 5, just you got your opponent on the ropes kind of thing.
I know that aggro kind of has its own item under the tree with things that are stompy. Isn't it basically like aggro but with bigger dudes?
Yeah, so Stompy is more, you're playing aggressive threats. They might not have haste, but you're playing a 3-mana 5/5, you know? Your opponent's Goblin Guide isn't gonna stand a chance against that thing. It's like, I now have to take my turn off to deal with your big creature, even though you're probably just going to play an even bigger one next turn. You're looking for that curve of like land Llanowar Elf, land big guy for 3, then like land even bigger guy, and then even bigger guy, and you're just making just big old buddies, and your opponent goes, yeah, I can't deal with those. I got a handful of bee stings and goblin electromancers.
And then kind of off of the control circle is stacks.
Right. And stacks in a way is you're more or less preventing your opponent from being able to play the game. You're not really proactive or reacting to what your opponent is doing. You're more of like covering yourself in a turtle shell, poking your head out every few like minutes and making sure everything's okay. And then once you realize your opponent's just standing there with his hands in his pockets because he can't do anything, that's when you pull out the baseball bat and turn into Negan and Glen him.
I consider myself to be a big fan of stacks, and it is a very like restrictive and preventative strategy, but you also have to find that sweet spot of, I want to prevent my opponent from doing things,
but I can't do it so much where I can't do anything.
Right. And that's like a balance that I've worked hard to find over the last year, is going from being like completely oppressive to everyone to just oppressive to my opponent, so that way I can win, basically. Kind of another offshoot of like the combo between aggro and control, like we talked about mid-range, but there's also tempo. What's the difference?
They're kind of like the same thing in a sense, but tempo, usually you have blue, that's where your tempo comes in. You're being proactive and reactive to what your opponent is doing, but you're also not losing resources for the main part, because you're also playing cards that refill your hand. Your opponent may be aggressive and just like hitting you a whole bunch, but you don't really care. You're drawing your cards, you got some removal, more or less waiting for your time to strike like a snake, but not in the same rights as combo. You and your opponent are both like playing the game, but eventually you're gonna draw more cards than your opponent. Your opponent is going to lose the war of attrition. Your opponent is just gonna be like, oh, I have 4 lands in play, a lightning bolt, and a goblin guide. And you're gonna go, oh cool, I have 7 cards in my hands, and it's just all gas. And usually in tempo, your removal isn't like hard removal, right? You have your lightning bolts and stuff like that, but usually in tempo, you're playing like stuff that puts their opponent's stuff back into their hand, so they have to waste their turn recasting it. With tempo, you're also regaining those resources, and you're making your opponent like have to replay their stuff over and over and over again, but you're sitting there nice and pretty because like you have your brazen borrowers and things like that, where you can bounce their hard worked for spell back to their hand, and then on your turn you get to play a 3/1 flyer, and then they have to play their big threat again, and you can just return it back to their hand once again, and you just kind of win the game by that. You constantly, it is referred to as time walked your opponent, because it's essentially like you're getting to take extra turns while your opponent isn't really able to do a whole lot because you're being so proactive to what your opponent is doing. You eventually win the game through your beats.
I think in my head, I understand the difference. I'm going to say it and you can tell me if I'm wrong. Okay, so mid-range is trying to extend the game to get their big thing.
Right.
And they are going to adjust their strategy depending on what their opponent is playing.
Right.
Whereas tempo is basically saying, we have started at the starting line together. I'm going to ensure
that it's an even race the entire time.
Right. So if you start to get too far ahead, I'm going to pull you back, and then I'm going to pull myself ahead. And we're going to just make sure that we are staying as close to even as possible. But it's not really even, because I'm also still going to make sure that I'm just a little bit ahead.
Right.
So it's less about adjusting your strategy depending on your matchup and more about like using your resources in the right areas to play that like seesaw teeter-totter kind of thing.
Your ultimate goal is to have the teeter-totter like this. You want to be on the upside and have your opponent a little on the downside, but your opponent's probably still thinking that they're good. They're still in this game, but in reality, you've drawn and you've seen so many cards. You have so much stuff in your hands compared to your opponent that there's just no physical way for your opponent to climb back from it.
Yeah,
but they're still seeing the teeter-totter as you're only a little bit ahead of me.
Yeah, they think that they like get a little jump and they might get it, but then you're gonna add it back over. You're gonna put a little sandbag on them.
It's like if your dad comes over and sits on the seesaw and you and all your friends are trying to lift him up, right? And then he grabs a pet rock. So it makes it too heavy. And you have to ask your smaller friend to climb up the seesaw to be able to lift your dad up.
Is that how it is?
Yeah, I believe so. Bluey taught me that.
So now that you have somewhat of an idea of what all these different words mean, we hope that when you hear people talk about their decks or you're looking up different decks or strategies for formats that you want to try to play, that you have these little clues. And that way you can follow along with us as we start to teach you formats and find the decks that are good for you.
We went over a lot of different archetypes and deck strategies and stuff, but I want to say that we didn't go over every single one. That video would be 47 hours long. So we were just trying to narrow it down to just the more common ones, because like you might hear people refer to Tron or Blue Farm, random things, and you're like, what the hell are these people talking about? That's just archetypes in different formats have different names, kind of thing.
Or they might have different names for kind of the same thing, because you might hear someone talk about a turbo, and a turbo is just a combo that goes zoom, just real fast. The Venn diagram, if we actually completed it, would be absolutely insane, because there's lots of different things and lots of weird like offshoots and things that are popular here and there. This is truly just to get you to get the basis of
what different strategies you might see in the game.
Right, because no matter what flavor, no matter what colors, no matter what their end game actually is, whatever they're doing is some form of what we've talked about. It might be called something different. For the most part, what you're gonna see is what we've discussed. Thanks so much for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/thegrimtutors, or you can check us out at all of the social medias at GrimTutorsMTG.
Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
It's literally just like the idea of starting.
I'm just a sleepy guy. Hello, everybody. My name's Markiplier.
Nope, that's not it.
Hello, everyone. My name's Colton. Fuck. It's quiche.
Sure, it's egg dish.
Yeah, I've never had a quiche before. Sorry, my brain is just like fucking ghost towning right now. I want to do the Stebbiverfest. You know? Monk. We're recording an episode, Tyler. Toodaloo.